Most people think credit scoring punishes irresponsibility. That is only partly true. A lot of the time, it punishes bad timing. That is the real secret inside this whole subject. Not because the system is broken, because most people do not understand when the system is actually taking its picture. They think their score is reacting to whether they paid on time. Sometimes it is. But a huge part of what they are feeling month to month is not about the payment date at all. It is about the statement closing date. That is the date that matters far more than most people realize. And if you do not understand that date, you can do everything that feels responsible and still watch your score move the wrong way. That is exactly the frustration the source document you gave me was trying to capture. A person uses a card heavily during the month. They have the cash they pay in full, no interest, no late fees, no missed payments, and then their score drops. They think the system must be wrong, but the system is not reacting to the part they thought it was reacting to. It is reacting to the utilization that got reported before their payment ever had a chance to matter. That is the whole story. And once you understand that, the subject stops feeling mysterious. It becomes mechanical. That is the word I want you to keep in your head. Mechanical, the scoring system is not really asking, did this person mean well? It is asking, what did the lender report? That is why timing matters so much. Now let us start with the foundation. The source transcript said payment history is 35% of a FICO score and amounts owed are 30%. That is correct as a general weighting framework. FICO says payment history is the largest category at 35%, while amounts owed, which includes credit utilization, is the next major category at 30%. FICO also notes that these percentages are general and can vary somewhat by profile, but the hierarchy is absolutely real. Utilization matters a lot. That alone should tell you why this subject deserves attention. Nearly a third of the scoring framework is tied to how much of your available revolving credit appears to be in use, not how much you pay in interest, not whether you emotionally feel responsible, how much appears to be in use. That last phrase is the key because your score is built off reported information, not real. Time, moral truth. Now let us talk about what actually gets reported. The source transcript said banks take a monthly snapshot, usually around the statement closing date, and that the reported balance often hits the bureaus before the payment due date. That is broadly right. Experian explains that credit card issuers generally report balances once a month, often at the end of the billing cycle or statement period, and that this reported balance can differ from what you later pay by the due date. That means a person can pay in full every month, pay zero interest, and still have a reported balance high enough to hurt utilization in the short term. That is the timing trap. If the bank reports a high balance on the statement close, the bureaus receive a high balance. Your later payment may protect you from interest. It may not protect you from that month's reported utilization. That is why so many people feel as if the system is working against them. It is not working against them. It is working on a delayed photograph. That is the better way to understand it. Now let us talk about utilization itself, because this is where the source transcript was strongest. People often hear simple rules like stay under 30%. That is a decent survival rule. It is not the best score rule. Under 30% is often considered acceptable. But the best scores generally live much lower than that. The source used the 1% rule and pointed toward the idea that excellent scores often report tiny balances, not large ones. That is directionally right. FICO and many credit educators consistently emphasize that lower revolving utilization is better, all else equal. A person with strong scores often has utilization in the low single digits rather than flirting with 20% or 30%. Now let us make this more precise. This does not only apply to your total utilization across all cards, it also applies to individual cards. That is another place where people get surprised. You can have a lot of total available credit and still get hit. If one small limit card reports a very high percentage usage, the scoring model notices both the aggregate picture and the per card picture. So if one $600 card reports nearly maxed out while your larger cards are sitting nearly empty, you can still create score damage from that single account. That matters because people often think, my total utilization is fine. Maybe your single card utilization may still look ugly. And ugly snapshots are what cause unnecessary score drops. Now let us get to the phrase people love repeating. Utilization has no memory. That sentence was mostly true for older scoring models, and the source transcript was smart enough to mention that a newer model changes the story. Experian says that most traditional FICO models mainly look at your current reported utilization, but FICO 10T can consider trended data over time, including whether balances have been rising or falling. That means the old no memory idea is becoming less universally true in the newest model family. And here is where we need to be current, not sloppy. The source transcript said FICO 10T exists, but that the vast majority of lenders still use older models. That was mostly fair when said in older videos, but it now needs updating. FHFA announced in April 2026 that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are moving forward on adoption efforts for FICO 10T. And FHA also joined the transition toward FICO 10T and VantageScore 4.0 in mortgage lending. FHFA says the enterprises expect to publish historical FICO 10T scores in summer 2026 and adopt scores from the model later. In other words, FICO 10T is no longer some distant idea. It is still not universal across all lending today, but it is meaningfully closer to real implementation in major mortgage channels than many people realize. That matters because the strategy should be described honestly. Managing your statement balance timing is still very useful, extremely useful, but the clean old idea that utilization fully resets every month with zero historical context is becoming less complete as trended. Data models gain adoption. That does not destroy the strategy. It just means the best long-term profile is not only one low statement balance one month, it is consistently good behavior over time. That is the adult update. Now let us come to the practical strategy the source called the loophole. I would not call it a loophole. I would call it control, because what you are really doing is choosing what balance gets reported. If your card statement closes on the 15th and your current balance on the 12th is much higher than you want the bureaus to see, you can make a payment before the statement closes. That lowers the balance that is captured on the statement. Then the statement reports the lower amount. Then you can pay the remaining statement balance by the due date and still pay no interest if you have handled it correctly. That is not gaming the system. That is learning the system. There is a difference. Now let us talk about the 1% idea and the all zero except one strategy, because this is where people either get smart or become obsessive. The source transcript said reporting zero on every card is not always optimal, and that many top scores show a tiny reported balance rather than all zeros. That is a well-known scoring concept, and it is directionally sound for many traditional FICO models. The logic is simple. The system likes to see revolving credit being used and managed, not sitting perpetually unused. So some people intentionally let one card report a very small balance while the others report zero. That is the all zero except one approach, often called AZEO. Now, I do not want to oversell that into superstition. You do not need to live your life around a $10 balance with religious intensity. The point is not ritual. The point is that extremely low utilization is usually better than moderate utilization, and a tiny reported balance can sometimes score a little better than all zeros on older models. That is useful. It is not magic. And here's the biggest thing I want people to avoid: confusing reported balance with carried balance. Those are not the same thing. A person can let a tiny balance report on the statement and still pay that statement balance in full by the due date. That does not mean they carried debt and paid interest. It means they allowed a small amount to be reported before clearing it. That is a very different behavior. Now let us talk about how to actually use this in real life. First, find the statement closing date on every card. Not the due date, the closing date. Those are not the same thing. The due date is when the statement balance must be paid to avoid interest. The closing date is when the statement is generated and the reportable balance is often created. Confusing those two dates is where most people stay stuck. Second, set reminders a few days before the closing date, not the night before if your bank transfer takes time a few days. Give yourself a real margin. Third, manually pay down balances before the statement closes if you want lower utilization to report. Fourth, still pay the remaining statement balance by the due date. Never let the optimization game create a late payment. A late payment is vastly more damaging than a utilization bump. That is not even close. Now let us say something about credit cycling, because the source transcript brought it up, and it is worth the warning. If you repeatedly max out a card, pay it mid-cycle, and then max it again, some issuers can see that as suspicious or risky behavior. Not always, but it can attract attention if your normal spending is constantly too large for your limits. The better move is often to request a higher credit limit or spread the spend across multiple cards, not to run one card into the ceiling again and again. That is a cleaner solution. Now let us zoom out, because this whole subject can make people weird. They start obsessing over every point, every balance, every tiny movement, and that usually makes them less effective, not more. The real value of understanding this system is not to become neurotic. It is to stop being accidentally sloppy. That is a big difference. If you know your statement date, keep utilization low, avoid maxing individual cards, pay on time, and maintain that pattern consistently. you are doing the things that matter. You do not need to turn your calendar into a military operation unless you are optimizing right before a mortgage application or some other major credit event. That is the sane way to handle this. And that is where I think the best version of the source transcript lands. Not in the phrase, banks don't want you to know. That is just YouTube language. The real value is simpler. Most people are trying to be responsible. They just never learned that the system measures responsibility on a different day than the one they thought mattered most. Once you know that, you stop getting surprised by score drops that feel unfair. You start controlling the snapshot. And when you control the snapshot, you start getting credit for the behavior you were already trying to have in the first place. That is not a loophole. That is clarity. And clarity is usually what separates average results from excellent ones.